Well, good morning or good afternoon, whatever time you might be listening. We welcome you once again to the Bible Beyond the Basics podcast. This is Bob and Jason. We welcome you to episode 13 of our podcast. So this morning, I was heading in. I was in Riverside, and I was trying to cross the bridge this morning.
Yes.
And there was a big traffic buildup. I was all the way back near Heaters and just could not get across. And I looked forward and realized there was a great big crane sitting on the bridge this morning. And so there was traffic going back and forth. There were the people letting people through and not and such. So eventually I got around and I turned to the right as I crossed the bridge. And, you know, naturally I look over to see what the heck they're trying to get out of the water. I was also looking as I'm crossing the bridge, like, are there any breaks? Did something go through the bridge into the water? But lo and behold, it was a pileup of trees that had come down and just landed right there at one of the pillars right under the bridge, and they're trying to get them out.
Oh, okay.
It takes so much work to be able to get that stuff up, and all that, to make the sea move, to make our river as it is, the Susquehanna River, to make it flow, to make it clear. We had to get that great big crane, and all Moses had to do was lift his staff, and it was all done.
Yeah.
So what's going on there, Bob?
Hey, we're talking.
Why didn't we just pull out a staff?
Yeah, move that aside. Okay, yeah. Exodus 14, how could Moses part the Red Sea? Well, first of all, there's heresy in the question. Because Moses did not part the Red Sea.
God parted the Red Sea.
Yeah. We talked about this a couple of sessions back. You know, that was part of the problem. I think they need to get Moses out of the limelight, because everybody was starting to give Moses way too much credit.
Yeah.
And when you get a whole lot of credit, you'd start tending to believe it. And Moses was beginning to, I think, believe it.
Yeah.
It's one reason why I don't like a lot of compliments, because I'll start, I know I'm weak enough to start currying the favor and wanting more.
Yeah.
So don't thank me. The glory goes to God, and that's not just pietistic. That's just safeguarding my own ego.
I remember, I initially, as a pastor, you know, you get compliments on sermons and such, and you know, if it can happen on most weeks and such, and you have to learn how to respond. And so, you know, if somebody compliments you on it, you can say, my pastor taught me to say, well, glory to be God, it's all God who's doing it, such and such. So I heard one person had an experience saying that, and they ended up saying, no, it wasn't that good.
That's excellent. Yeah. I usually, reply, I steal from good material. But yeah, actually, it's also humbling, because I remember getting a really big compliment on Boy Scout Sunday for a sermon I preached, except I didn't preach that Sunday. So, and I also knew it was the time of my acceptance and approval as a pastor in the pulpit, when my father came to visit one of my first Sundays here at Grove, and he fell asleep. So, you know
you'd made it.
But so the whole, how could Moses part the Red Sea? He didn't. Again, the whole idea of instrumentality through human nature. It's not as if God really can do anything without people. So it was really God that did it. God provided the manna. God provided the quails. God provided the water. God provided the tabernacle, the guidance, the leadership. Moses was a means through which that happened, using his personality. And that's important. It's kind of going in a different direction than I expected this morning, but because it was Abraham Heschel on his work on the prophets. Spoke about a prophet as a partner in the divine pathos, and that we're not empty vessels, but God uses our various personalities.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not simply we're like wind instruments that God is making music with.
Yeah.
God is actually using who we are and our particular gifts and skills and failures and mistakes.
When I first started learning more about faith and starting to understand more as a Christian, people were talking about the Holy Spirit. And one of the questions that immediately came to mind is like, well, if we're guided by the Holy Spirit, what happens to artistic freedom and such? And what happens to freedom? Am I truly myself if we're talking about this? And eventually I came to realize, like, that there's not that much going on. Like, God is not that much at work in my life.
Well,
but yeah, it's just the sense of, like, where is God working? Where are ourselves working? Where is that line? Where do those things meet? And it's in nature as well. What parts of us are God? What parts of us are just us?
And well, you're triggering in me Jonathan Edwards and the thoughts of free will. And basically the concept is we have free will within our nature. I have the will to decide what I'm going to wear today. I have the will to decide what I'm going to choose today according to my nature. I do not have the will to go beyond my nature. I cannot affect my own salvation.
Yeah.
And so it's a wonderful way of navigating the idea of God is not a marionette master, but we're given opportunities. And the question is, well, that's the whole concept of the way, the truth, and the life. It's the idea of we're on a way, and are we going to follow that path, or are we going to trespass or incur debts, whichever Lord's Prayer you want to use.
Yeah.
So going into the back to Exodus 14, and the idea of the visual imagery of parting the Susquehanna. Which by the way would expose a lot of rocks and coal, and I don't think we could cross it. Bridges are somewhat useful. And oh, by the way, I also don't think it was the Red Sea. Most of the commentators of a more serious anagogical nature will look that it was the Reed Sea, which because the Hebrews were largely in the land of Goshen, which is in the northern part of Egypt, going toward the highway up the coast. So it was
makes more sense geographically.
It was the lowlands of the Nile and that portion, so it was marshland. And so a lot of people speculate it was the Reed Sea, and that which chariots cannot really cross or armored vehicles cannot cross. A refugee people, similar to crossing the Rio Grande, can do it. It's kind of hard if we wanted to get a tank across the Rio Grande. So it's just so it's a little bit more logical, and a lot of people will path that because the Red Sea is pretty big. The other thing is that and I couldn't remember Charlton Heston's name the other week. And the thing about Moses and holding the staff and the great winds and the parting of the sea.
Yeah.
And boy, do biblical movies damage the Bible. I'll be blunt, folks. I cannot really watch them because they drive me nuts. Largely because, well, it goes to, and I'm going to quote Mary Hackenberg if you're out there. Hello, Mary, this is you. I remember you telling me you had your children in elementary school read Charlotte's Web. And you had a great time with the kids reading it and discussing it. And then you confessed you made a mistake because at the end of the spring semester, you showed them the movie of Charlotte's Web. And one little girl, you reported, got really upset and said, "That's not what the barn looks like." Because these movies have a way of searing the imagery in our brains.
Yeah.
In not necessarily a helpful way. It doesn't conjure up the imagination.
Yeah. If you watch a movie and then read the book, it's going to immediately influence what you think of. It's going to give you images of what the people look like.
And so, keeping with our consistent theme here of what's the theology, let's not get too into the weeds or the reeds of the situation. What is important in the crossing over? What is important is the idea of water being parted. What is the theological message of that? Especially if you're Hebrew, because in the Hebrew thinking, water had two basic messages. One, it was necessary for life. And go ask my kids out in the West right now what's happening in the West with our droughts.
You have Jesus coming into the water festival in the midst of the water festival and saying, "All who are thirsty, come to me and drink."
Yeah.
It's a theme that carries on throughout the Hebrew tradition.
And how precious water was. Without water, there is no life. There's no crops. There's nothing. And the Hebrew thinking was that water, again, their cosmology was not an understanding of the Earth as a planet in orbit. The cosmology was it was like a pan. That the Earth was a pan, and it was protected over by a copper sheeting. And around the top of the copper sheeting and underneath were the waters of chaos that had been separated, as Genesis will recount. And every now and then God opens God's hands and there's a flood, or God will open and there's going to be a flood that percolates up. Okay, it also helps explain why there's oceans and lakes and things like that.
Yeah.
So that was their understanding. So they felt very, as much as they valued water and as a source of life, they also were terrified of water as the source of swirling chaos. And so if we think of the parting of the sea as a way of separating and preserving people in the midst of chaos, whenever you hear the word water in the Hebrews, it's either going to be life or it's going to be chaos. It's going to be destructive. And it certainly proved
As
that way.
we've already talked about with the flood, with Noah, and all of that, the waters being chaos, and God having control over that chaos, God separating the sky from the water and the land and all of that stuff. It's a theme that we've seen continue throughout what we've looked at so far.
Exactly. And God's going to separate it out to preserve, to assist in the deliverance of the refugee Hebrews, to go into the wilderness and struggle. You're being freed to struggle.
Yeah.
It's going to replay with Joshua and the Jordan. It's going to replay there. Paul picks up on the whole theme, and this is a lovely thought. And it truly is. It's a beautiful thought. In 1st or 2nd Corinthians, I'm not sure which, the idea of the waters of Romans also. The waters, you pass through the waters in order to get into new life. Oh, you mean baptism?
Yeah. Yeah. And you find that emphasis in Peter as well. But even that word baptizo, we don't have an equivalent word for it in English. We don't translate it. We just transliterate it, which means we basically take the word from Greek and put it into our language because we don't have anything like it. But there is some connotation around that word baptism of some violence, and even the idea of drowning happening. It's an idea of new life, but it's also an idea of an ending, a sacrifice as well. Just like we talked about last week, we're freed from something in order to be freed to something else. And the question is, what are we being freed to? And even sometimes we see the Israelites wandering around in the desert. They were freed from what they were doing. They were saying, I don't have the food that I want to eat. I wish I could go back there. They were freed from something. They were freed to something else that they didn't anticipate.
Yeah, and Paul picks up on that absolutely beautifully in the passage of 6, 7, and 8 in Romans. Baptism, you die. The old you dies in order to be reborn as Christ's own. And then you got to figure out how. You're freed from the law.
Yeah.
But you're still going to be cursed by the law, but you have to work it through with the Spirit of God as to how you're going to live out by the Spirit of God in the new covenant. And then you're freed from death. Well, no, you're not. You're still going to die.
Yeah.
But you're freed from the tyranny. And that's the thing. You're freed from the tyranny of the old. You're freed from the tyranny of the law. And you're freed from the tyranny of death.
Mm-hmm.
You're freed for a life in Christ. And so that whole wilderness, the whole Red Sea is really this whole idea of crossing over through waters of chaos.
You're freed from the idea that death has total control over your life, that all you're thinking about is, oh, I'm going to die someday, and that becomes the all-consuming thought. You're free to live in such a way as to say, we're going to reframe this. How can I live my life positively? What can I do with my life to the glory of God?
Yeah, well, and the book of Ecclesiastes, for example, vanity of vanities is what we call, but the actual translation is actually futility of futility. The writer of Ecclesiastes was not a happy kind of guy.
Yeah.
But he eventually realizes, okay, what is the purpose of life?
Yeah.
It doesn't go into more of a doctrinal position as it does into the idea of, well, how can I live in the here and now? Mm-hmm. So this powerful motif of crossing over, finishing up, we got a wonderful Paul Simon here, Simon and Garfunkel, because we can bridge over troubled waters. Okay, we create our own bridges, and with the engineering help, basically the idea is the waters will either destroy you or hold you up or frustrate you, or you can pass over them or through them into a whole new beginning.
Yeah. One of my favorite passages is, and it's just the strange little passage in the Gospels where Jesus is teaching, and then he gets in the boat, and it just says, and he went to the other side.
Uh-huh.
And he's got new ministry to do over there. And God crosses us from one place to another so many times in our lives.
Yeah.
And things get left behind, but there's new things to start on the other side. And sometimes in those transitions it can be a lot of chaos.
Which it goes exactly why the Bible begins with Abraham.
Yeah.
Stepping out,
going to a new place. We don't exactly know why he's leaving.
Right.
What's going on there in that situation and that background, but just stepping out into chaos and being led by God to a new place.
Yeah. Or, as I mentioned last week, Russ Cotner calling you and saying, I need another coach.
Yeah.
But that's the power of God is not no. The power of God is yes.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, is my favorite novel, Ulysses, how it ends with the whole idea of Molly saying at the end of the book, yes, the most powerful word in the Bible, in humanity is yes.
Or as Bart said, God's yes is bigger than God's no.
Yeah. So we're crossing over, folks. And next week, by the way, some of the weird stuff, we'll do a quick look at Og's oversized bed, but the other weird, and how can an ass talk? And I have a very easy answer for that one.
I've heard it. All right, thanks everyone. Have a great week.